advisory verdict. I mean, I don't, and it's not it may not be necessary for them to even consider that question, right? You could imagine Monsanto making an argument to the jury. All right, well, let's say you believe Dr. Portier and Dr. Ritz, and you believe that these studies, support their view that this thing is capable of causing cancer. It just didn't do it in Mr. Hardiman's case. And if the jury agrees with that, then they don't need to decide the broader question. And so it seems a little weird to me to ask the jury the broader question.
Well, I mean, this whole idea of phasing, right, is part of the court's reasoning was, listen, this will actually help tell us information, right? And, this is a special verdict form already. And people ask.
Well, I mean, it wasn't really this will help give us information. It was this will be the fairest way to run the trial.
Sure, and you also mentioned that it would give us that was the second part of your opinion. There's a paragraph about it. I'm really not making
responding to your assertion that it's not going to give us any information.
That's right.
That's
Fair
not
enough.
True. It's going to give us information.
Fair enough. Maybe I should characterize. It's not the reason why you did it, but it was you rejected our arguments saying that it would help us. Okay. I think it's really helpful for us to know exactly what the jury does. I mean, we ask juries all the time special interrogatories. We do, right? Because we want to see what the jury thought about certain issues. I mean, that's one of the few benefits of having a jury, right? Is we can actually use them as an advisory group to answer questions about facts, right? And this is a factual question. And so, if they don't get past step one, then they don't get to step two, right? They go, no, it doesn't cause cancer, we're done. But that would be very helpful for our understanding, I think, but from all the thousands of cases around the country and breaking that apart. I think there's also
I understand why you proposed it. I didn't. That had escaped me when I was looking at this.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise it's like an extra burden on our part, right? We have to prove two questions instead of one.
I was kind of wondering why. It didn't strike me as necessarily to your advantage in this trial. Yep. But I mean, I guess the question I have about that is, you represent Mr. Hardiman in this trial.
That's correct.
You represent anybody else in this trial.
That's correct.
Mr. Hardiman. So, have you had a serious conversation with Mr. Hardiman about whether you should propose a verdict form along these lines?
I don't know about. I haven't personally, Your Honor. I'm sure there has been conversations with Mr. Hardiman.
Not your case. It's Mr. Hardiman's case.
No, I understand that. But I mean, we object to this whole phasing altogether, right? We've made our record clear on that.
But once we phase the case, I would think you would want to litigate it in a way that would be most to the advantage of Mr. Hardiman, without regard to the other plaintiffs in the case. Or maybe to put it slightly differently, you certainly wouldn't want to do anything that would disadvantage Mr. Hardiman.
Sure, I don't.
In order to gather your own information about how you would value the other 1,000 cases that you've brought.
Fair enough, Your Honor. I actually think this does benefit Mr. Hardiman. It's not obvious on his face.
You introduced this whole topic by conceding that it was not to your advantage.
Well, I can see that it looks like it's not to our advantage. I personally, if I'm closing argument, I want these two questions.
Why?
Because I think that I feel comfortable disclosing my trial strategy too much, but I think that the first.
If you want these two questions,
sure.
And it would require you to disclose your trial strategy to get these two questions asked, you better disclose your trial strategy.
All right. It's because they haven't offered any specific causation opinion. Their entire defense is general causation. That's it. They say the AHS is great, EPA says it doesn't cause cancer. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all you have to see. And that's where we beat them. Because the science, when you actually look at the studies, this is our viewpoint. When you actually look at the studies, I think it's actually overwhelming. And I think you go through it, you go case control after case control study, animal study after animal study, genotox study after genotox study shows that this causes cancer, right? And so what is their best defense for why it doesn't cause his specific cancer? It's because it doesn't generally cause cancer. That's their entire, and I want to rip them apart in closing argument on the science on that point.
Do all that without a two-question special verdict.
I guess we could. This would be helpful.
It really raises a question for me whether you are actually thinking about Mr. Hardiman's interests in this case, or whether, as you strongly suggested in your presentation, you're thinking about the lawyer's overall interests in valuing the other cases. So what I would suggest you do is go back to your team and make sure there has been a real conversation with Mr. Hardiman about offering questions that, special verdict questions that may be to his disadvantage.
Your Honor, I just want to...
And we can talk about it again at the pretrial conference.
Fair enough, Your Honor.
As of now, we're just going to ask the one question, which is, was Monsanto's Roundup a substantial factor in causing Mr. Hardiman's non-Hodgkin's lymphoma?
Okay, Your Honor. And I just want to say one thing. Throughout these years of this litigation, you've made comments to me that have been picked up in the media. And in fact, Monsanto has used your comments from the bench to try to prevent me from being in other cases. I just want you to know, you've now just sort of accused me of violating my ethical rules to my client, and I respectfully, strongly disagree with that. I don't think there's anybody in this room who works harder for Mr. Hardiman than I do.
I don't know if you violated the ethical rules or not, but it's a very strange argument to come up here and say, this is not really to our advantage in this trial, but we want to ask the question because it will be helpful to evaluate future cases. That's a strange thing to say when you are charged with representing Mr. Hardiman's interests in this case. And then in response to my question, did you talk to Mr. Hardiman about this? You say no, and
I haven't personally.
Hope that somebody from your team did. But the next time you offer something in the trial that you think is not necessarily to your strategic benefit in this particular trial, you may want to make sure you've talked to your client about it first.
I think you're misstating what I said. I said it appears that way, Your Honor, and then I explained to you how I think it actually benefits us. So I apologize if there was a miscommunication on that point. I just want to point out that these comments you've made, you say I misrepresent evidence and spin, they then go to other courts and say, Judge Chhabria thinks Brent's a liar. I mean, you've actually done this multiple times.
Well, then don't misrepresent the evidence.
Respectfully disagree, Your Honor, but I appreciate that. Thanks.
Ready for the Daubert hearing? Yeah.
You should be able to hear us now.
I have 2 more copies.
Pass it to Joe.
Yeah.
Okay. Ms. Wagstaff, are you ready to proceed?
Greet with him to make sure we can hear him.
Sure, go ahead.
All right, can you guys see me? It's a white screen. Catherine? Okay, so can you guys see me? Okay, so your screen is white. If you could turn on your... Okay. Oh, that's the that's the back screen. Dr. Schustoff, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right, I'm going to ask the judge to say something to see if you can hear him because he'll be asking you questions.
Hi, Dr. Schustoff. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, I can. Hello, Your Honor.
Okay, great. You can proceed then.
All right, do we need
Do
to
we
swear
need to
in?
administer the oath? Why don't, Dr. Schustoff, why don't we begin with administering the oath? My courtroom deputy will do that right now.
Okay. I do. First name Andre, A-D-R-E-I. Last name Shustov, H-S-T-O-V.
All right, Dr. Schustoff, are you ready to begin?
Yes, I am.
All right, so thank you for joining us today from Seattle. I'd like to start with you telling us a little bit about yourself, your background and your history and where you're from.
So, my name is Andre Shustov. I am a medical oncologist at the University of Washington. I'm also part of the faculty in the Division of Hematology. I'm a professor of medicine and hematology. I came to U.S. with a medical degree in 1995 and joined the research group at the University of Maryland to do research in lymphocyte biology and lymphocytic disease. So I did 6 years of bench research studying immune system. Afterwards, I joined a residency program at the York Hospital, Pennsylvania, where I completed 3 years of medical residency to become an internal medicine physician. And afterwards, I entered the fellowship training program in hematology and medical oncology at the University of Washington Cancer Research Center in Seattle. I completed my hematology oncology training in 2006, and I joined the faculty of the Division of Hematology at that time. And for the past 13 years in July, I was a faculty member in those institutions and specifically focusing on diagnosing, treating, and helping patients with lymphomas, cancers of lymphatic system, as well as being engaged in medical students, medical residents, fellows, part of the teaching curriculum of the University of Washington. In the last 5-6 years, I joined numerous national and international lymphoma panels and councils, where I participate in discussion of establishment of standards of care and directions of national to national research in lymphomas. And I also serve in several committees in our home to prioritize and scrutinize clinical trials in lymphomas and other cancers. On a personal level, me and my wife live in Seattle. I have 3 sons. I enjoy hiking, cooking, hobby of my wife, which is scuba diving.
All right, well, thank you very much. And you are board certified in a couple of different disciplines, correct?
That is correct. I'm triple boarded, being certified in internal medicine, hematology, and medical oncology.
Okay, and you're licensed to practice medicine in the state of Washington, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and would it be fair to say that you've treated hundreds of patients with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma?
It would be more than fair. I think I would estimate over the past 13 years I have treated, consulted on, or have been involved in the care of over 3,000 to 4,000 patients with lymphoma.
Okay, and you teach students at the University of Washington about non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, correct?
That is correct. At the university hematology course, I teach, besides lymphomas, the basics of hematology and blood system and immune system. But the majority of my clinical teaching involves medical residents, so graduates of medical schools, and also oncology, hematology fellows. Those are physicians who decided to dedicate their career to cancer and blood disorders.
and you've been involved with several clinical trials, correct?
Yes, it is correct. Over a 13-year career here in the University of Washington, I have chaired or served what we call principal investigator of over 50 clinical trials of new agents and new therapeutic approaches.
Okay. And today, are you giving an opinion on general causation?
No, I'm not. I was asked to opine on specific causation of lymphoma in 3 subjects.
Okay, so how are you basing your opinion that exposure to Roundup can cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma?
Well, the basis of my opinion on these 3 subjects was first of all, the background education in medicine, my training in oncology, my experience in treating and caring for patients with lymphomas, but finally, extensive review of very thorough medical records that I was provided, consists of thousands of pages of their treatment history, diagnosis history, laboratory pathology values, as well as having encountered all 3 subjects, performing thorough physical exam, and collecting personally their history, their medical history, social history, history of exposure, and finally doing a literature search and thoroughly reviewing the reports of general causation experts, Dr. Weisenberger, Patier, and Ritz, to form my opinion, which I was asked to do based on the general assumption that Roundup is the risk factor for lymphoma.
Okay, so is it fair to say that if you testify at one of the federal trials, your opinion that exposure to Roundup can cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, you will be relying on plaintiffs' other experts to proffer that opinion? Is that correct?
That is correct, and the experts in general causation.
Okay. And did you do an exposure analysis? Well, let me back up a minute. You have proffered an opinion on Mr. Hardiman, Mr. Gabayu, and Ms. Stevick, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And did you do an exposure analysis on those 3 plaintiffs?
I collected a very detailed history that I was asked to opine on from all 3 subjects on their use of Roundup, which included the frequency, the duration overall through a lifetime, and my assessment of what area of their property they used the Roundup to give me the idea of oral use of exposure.
Hang on one second. Just 1 second, sorry. The court reporter was catching up.
Yeah, we had a little glitch on the video. And
He said the area.
We didn't catch something that you said, so if you could back up about 2 sentences, and if, to the extent you can remember.
Okay, so I collected that history from patients so I could make a match or reference to published literature on exposure, so I can compare the exposure that the subject had to the levels that were used in general causation literature to estimate the risk of lymphoma.
Okay, so you actually met in person with each of the 3 plaintiffs and conducted an exposure examination. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and then I think what you just said is that you compared the plaintiff's exposure to the exposure in the relevant epidemiological literature. Is that correct?
That's correct. So I compared the exposure in all 3 plaintiffs to the levels of exposure that were cited in epidemiologic literature to make sure that the exposure that the plaintiffs had was matched against the epidemiologic study to form my opinion on specific causation.
Okay, and so would it be fair to say that you use the epidemiological literature as a metric to determine if the plaintiffs fall within that category identified in the literature?
That's correct. I used the epidemiologic literature to give me some guidance in specific aspects so I can form an opinion
Okay, and did you focus on the epidemiologic literature that actually does a dose response analysis?
I read and reviewed epidemiologic literature to give you a reference for specific questions that I had for specific causation. And to more specific questions, yes, I do recall that I used specifically two references that in one of them, I believe, 10 days for a lifetime exposure, and the other one, 2 days per year exposure as a significant level where the risk ratio was significant for as a causation for the fall. This was as far as I went into really studying those papers where, again, I was looking for specific reference points.
Okay. Do you remember in your deposition being asked whether you considered the exact type or product that each one of the plaintiffs used?
I do remember those questions.
Okay. Do you remember also being asked whether or not you knew the percentage of glyphosate in each one of the products that the plaintiff used?
I think I remember those questions. Yeah.
Okay. And do you remember being asked questions about what surfactants were in the products that plaintiffs used?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And did you consider those topics from the plaintiffs? And if not, why not?
I did not consider those factors. The main reason was that those are the factors that I don't recall being cited in epidemiologic literature. So I did not really consider those as part of my specific causation determination.
Okay, so I just want to cite a couple specific examples that you were asked in your deposition. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. For example, you were asked if, in the Hardiman deposition, you were asked if Roundup comes into contact with a patient's skin, does that affect your opinion about exposure? Or whether the size of the area of the skin in contact with Roundup matter in your exposure assessment? And to both questions, you answered no, correct? Okay, we can move on. I'll withdraw that question. Okay. Did it matter to you, in your opinion, whether or not the plaintiff used a residential product or a commercial product?
It did not matter, no.
Why not?
It was not something that I recall being discussed in epidemiologic literature, and so I did not focus on that.
Okay. So now I'd like to talk about sort of your overall general methodology with respect to all three cases, and then we will go through each case one by one, okay? So in reaching your opinions in these cases, did you use the same methodology and rigor that you would apply in your academic and clinical practice?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And what methodology did you use to utilize to reach your opinions?
So I used the fundamental and I would say core methodology we use in everyday practice, diagnosing the disease or diagnosing causes of the disease, something called differential diagnosis, which on a broader scale is basically a hypothetical deductive method of coming to a conclusion about the diagnosis or cause of the condition.
Okay. So what did you do? What did you review with respect to prepare for your reports?
So once again, I think relating to previous questions, I reviewed thoroughly very full and comprehensive medical records that were provided to me on all three claims. I examined the patient, the history. I reviewed the general causation reports by experts in general causation, Weisenbergers, Cartiers, and Ritz. And I did a literature review, and I went over and read the literature that helped me to further form my opinion on general causation. I'm sorry, on specific causation.
Okay, and did you reference every piece of literature that you found in your searches, in your report?
I referenced the literature that I found pertinent and that I used to form my opinion on specific causation. When you do a literature search, you obviously find innumerable amount of publications that that is neither practical nor reasonable to review every single thing. So I referenced the literature and the sources that I used specifically in my report on specific causation.
Okay, and I think we mentioned earlier that you conducted in-person examinations with all three plaintiffs. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and so why don't you tell us why you did that and what the value in doing that towards your opinion?
To me, as a clinician and as a physician, there is no bigger value in either caring for a patient or opinion about specific patient than encounter with a patient and conversation with a patient and a first-hand collection of information and an exam. That's what I'm trained to do. That's why I'm considered the core of the physician. So it's very hard for me to find anything without talking to the patient himself and collecting history myself and doing the exam. Like I said, this is what I'm trained to do, and that's what I train other doctors to do. It's a core of physicians' work and physicians' assessment.
All right, so did you base your opinions for all three cases on your review of the medical records, your education, training, experience, and knowledge of the pertinent medical literature, including epidemiology?
That is correct.
Okay. So we talked about how you decided to include, so let's talk now about sort of the general causation portion of what you relied on. How did you determine that Roundup should be included in your differential diagnosis?
Well, when we created differential diagnosis for either diagnose the disease or cause of the disease, we generally try to be as as possible, so we don't miss it. It's very important, either diagnosis or causes. So I have included known causes or risk factors for lymphomas, such as exposure to radiation and family history or history of autoimmune disease or rheumatologic disease or immunodeficiencies, as well as factors we always ask patients in everyday practice whether they were exposed to things like radiation, military fumes or exhaust, military exfoliants or pesticides. So we try to be as inclusive as possible to create a differential diagnosis, and then one by one try to eliminate factors that are less likely or much less likely to be a risk factor. The reason I included the Roundup into my differential, one, it is a general risk factor as part of the pesticides that are listed in majority of, say, medical centers to be a risk factor and are accepted a risk factor for causal lymphomas, but also for the purpose of the trial, I was asked specifically to look at glyphosate exposure. Now, everyday practice, do I ask patients whether they use glyphosate? No. But the general question I always ask patients whether they have exposure to pesticides and radiation and other, like I said, military compounds or industrial known persistence.
Okay, so to be clear, prior to your involvement in this litigation, you asked your patients whether or not they had been exposed to pesticides. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And in your report, which I'd like to mark as exhibits, his three reports, we can mark the Hardiman report as Exhibit 1, the Gabayi report as Exhibit 2, and the Stevick report as Exhibit 3. Dr. Schustoff, do you have those reports in front of you?
I think those are what we're working on.
Okay. So in your report, Let me know when you're ready to begin. Okay. So in all three of your reports, you do include a brief section on general causation. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And you were asked at length in your deposition about whether or not you copied this general causation section of your report from Dr. Naban in a non-MDL report. Do you remember that testimony?
I do.
Okay. Please explain what you did and how that general causation section in your report got into your reports for all three plaintiffs.
Sure. So in preparation for my all three reports, as we discussed, I examined the patient, I reviewed all their medical records, I reviewed the reports by Weisenberger, Cartier, Ritz, and the literature, and I had, for my opinion, what's going to be in my report. And at that juncture, I asked the counsel that I was working with to give me some kind of guidance for template or example how these reports are being constructed, as I don't do these reports on regular basis. So, at that time, I had Dr. Naban's report in my possession where I reviewed how he described it. And after reviewing what I just mentioned, I felt that what he described was exactly, in essence, what I would put in my report, and I copied his description into my report as a background information. And not that dissimilar that in everyday practice we do, even in medical records, when I see patients and I have medical information from other physicians that is did not change, or that's exactly what I found for efficiency any time. So I copied part of Dr. Naban's report on general causation, the reference, so I can start working and specifically focusing on the specific causation part of the report.
Okay, and just to be clear, the portion of your report that is the same as Dr. Naban's report does not relate to your specific causation opinions, correct?
That is correct.
And your specific causation opinions for Mr. Hardiman, for Mr. Gabayu, and for Ms. Stevick are independent of the section that is the same as Dr. Naban's report. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, and the report of Dr. Naban that you were given as a template for general causation, it's your understanding that that report was not for a federal MDL case. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And how did Dr. Naban's report that you received factor into your decisions in Mr. Hardiman, Mr. Gabayu, and Ms. Stevick, if at all?
It did not factor at all into my decision. I used that as a template or as a background information to focus on what I was asked to do is a specific causation. And again, this is something that myself, my colleagues do on a daily basis to be efficient and actually focused on our specific opinions or specific reports. So I use that as a template, if you wish, or I copied the information into my report because that is exactly what I found by my reading the literature on specific causation. I'm sorry, on general causation.
All right. And did the portion of Dr. Naban's report that you have in your reports, did any of that cover your specific causation opinions or your differential diagnosis in any way?
No, it doesn't.
Okay. And so the section of your report that deals with your specific causation opinions and your differential diagnosis, did you come to those opinions on your own?
I'm sorry, how did I come about those decisions?
No, let me, I think you misunderstood me, or that maybe there's a technical issue. The section of your reports for Mr. Hardiman, Mr. Gabayu, and Ms. Stevick that relates to specific causation of those three cases and your differential diagnosis for those three cases, Did you come to those opinions on your own without the help of Dr. Nabhan's report?
No, absolutely not.
Absolutely not, or I think you misunderstood.
I did not copy anything relating to specific causation from Dr. Nabhan's report.
Okay, so just to hammer this home, your specific causation opinions would be the exact same even if you did not receive Dr. Nabhan's report?
That is correct.
Okay. So let's talk about the subtypes of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. You would agree that there are several different subtypes, right?
There are many different subtypes. As a matter of fact, our recent classification recognizes over 50 different subtypes of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Okay, is there a different causative mechanism for each NHL subtype?
As a general statement, many non-Hodgkin lymphomas, and probably majority of non-Hodgkin lymphomas, would have a similar risk factors or same risk factors for development. But there are very unique exceptions where we do have, we found out a very specific cause of very specific lymphomas. But those are exceptions of the rule. And to give an example, there is a lymphoma of the stomach that is caused by H. pylori. Everybody knows about H. pylori. So there's H. pylori associated stomach lymphoma. So this is a very specific example, which is an exception of the rule, what causes lymphomas. Or there's a very specific lymphoma that grows in people's eye and caused by chlamydia infection. And that's a very specific example of specific cause of that particular lymphoma. But outside those exceptions, the causes for majority of lymphomas are understood to be similar.
Okay, and the plaintiffs in this case all had diffuse DLBCL, right? Diffuse large B-cell lymphoma.
That is correct.
Okay, and Ms. Stevick had a further subtype. Can you tell me what subtype Ms. Stevick had of DLBCL?
Yeah, so Ms. Stevick had lymphoma found in the brain tissue, something we refer to as the primary CNS lymphoma, central nervous system lymphoma. So histologically, or the way these lymphomas look in the microscope, it's exactly the same lymphoma found in other two cases. And what's unique about your case is histography, where this lymphoma has risen. And if this lymphoma came up in any other part of the body, we would not even bother about naming the specific location. And the only reason we separate those differently is for purpose of treatment. Many therapeutic drugs, therapeutic agents that we use to treat lymphomas do not penetrate into the brain. So we have to separate out this primary CNS lymphoma for the purpose of using different regimens from any other lymphoma. On a microscopic level, it is diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, and it would be indistinguishable from other two cases that we have discussed if you did not tell pathologists that this lymphoma was in the brain.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about how you ruled in risk factors for your differential diagnosis, okay? And let's talk about your methodology for all three plaintiffs here. So when you were doing your differential diagnosis, how did you come up with a list of risk factors that you ruled into the differential diagnosis?
So,
Why don't you first start with telling us what a risk factor is and why it's important?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last question?
Yeah, could you start by telling us what a risk factor is and why it's important in your view?
Sure. So the risk factor for developing lymphoma, as any other cancer, is important because that tells us the possible substantial role or actually the positive role that factor might have played in developing. So the risk factor, we understand the risk factor is something that increased the chances
Okay, and how did you create a list of the risk factors for each of the three plaintiffs?
So again, I did the same type of methodology or approach to issues I use in everyday practice. There are known causes or there are known risk factors for lymphomas, just like other cancers. And I screen every patient who comes to my door for those known risk factors as part of what we call social history. So we ask them about family history of lymphoma. We ask them about history of autoimmune disease, the deficiencies, exposure to ionizing radiation, exposed to industrial toxins, military toxins, pesticides. Those are known risk factors that I put into differential diagnosis for this case. I did include the Roundup in differential diagnosis of risk factors for those two reasons that I already stated before. First, pesticides in general, we look at as a risk factor, and I was asked for the purpose of this proceedings to specifically look into Roundup based on knowledge from general causation that's a risk factor for the phone.
So you were asked to base that on, like you had testified earlier about the other experts that plaintiffs will be proffering, correct? I'll strike that question. I'll strike that question. So for each of your opinions, did you consider that non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and its subtypes are sometimes idiopathic?
Well, the idiopathic is a funny term. So idiopathic means that we do not have any risk factors that we identify. Right? So then we call, well, we do not have any risk factors. Then idiopathic means there's factors out there that we're not aware of. But when you have risk factors that are identified, you cannot call something idiopathic. So you cannot exclude something that doesn't exist. We already have risk factors. So by definition, idiopathic is something that we call when no risk factors are identified. If you identify risk factors, idiopathic doesn't exist.
Okay, so you did consider that whether or not each plaintiff's NHL was idiopathic, it sounds like. Is that correct?
So on a general scale, we always consider that because of this particular person, lymphoma or other cancer, would be idiopathic, means that we don't know the cause. But once we start really looking into the causes of lymphoma and we identify the risk factors, it's no longer idiopathic.
Okay, so you considered idiopathic and ruled that out for each of the three plaintiffs because they had other risk factors. Is that correct?
Well, again, I don't think I would phrase it this way. You cannot rule out something that you don't know. But idiopathic means we don't know any causes. I cannot rule out something that doesn't exist. So if I did not identify any risk factors, I would say this lymphoma, not the cause, lymphoma is idiopathic, meaning that we cannot find what caused it. But once we identify risk factors and potential causes of some of this lymphoma, it's really, to me, nonsensical to say, did I rule out idiopathic? Something doesn't exist. So
sure.
Maybe.
No, were you finished? You can finish your response.
No, what I was going to say that I could not rule out that people have other unknown causes of lymphoma. But when you have something in your hands like identifiable risk factors, then you don't focus on something you don't know. And like I said, that's looking for something idiopathic when you already found the risk factors, to me, is nonsensical.
Okay, so let's talk about Mr. Hardiman and your opinion in his case. If you could pull his report up in front of you, we've marked it as Exhibit 1. You can put the other two reports. Okay, you can put the other two reports to the side for a moment. Okay, so if you will turn to page 5 of your report, where it says analysis of patients' risks for developing DLBCL. Tell me when you're there.
I have it.
Okay. Is this your list of risk factors that you considered?
That's correct.
Okay, so you list family history of NHL, and you stated that he didn't have any family history. Why don't you tell me the risk factors that you listed and how you ruled each one out? Let's just go through them. Number one.
Sure. So as I mentioned, in everyday practice, when I see new patients with newly diagnosed lymphoma, as a standard of care, we collect what's called social history. Even though it does not really affect how we treat patients, is a good practice. So we ask patients about family history of lymphomas. We ask patients about exposure to things like ionized radiation or agricultural pesticides or military compounds or industrial chemicals. So even though I don't have any prior information about those things, we elicit that information because patients sometimes do not volunteer that information unless we ask. So I asked Mr. Hardeman if he had any family history or extensive family history of lymphomas, and the answer was no. And the reason I included that because that's what we do in everyday practice to lay out any possible cause of somebody's lymphoma or known risk factor, known cause of lymphoma. So he did not have any family history. Then I asked him if he was diagnosed and treated on a regular basis with any known significant autoimmune diseases or immunodeficiency. And the answer was no. And I did not find anything in his medical records. Then I asked him about autoimmune disease, the same thing. I did not identify any significant medical records, and he did not volunteer any information. And then I asked him about when he was growing up or being a teenager or throughout his employment or military service, whether he was exposed to any other known risk factors, including, as I mentioned, military pollutants and fumes, any industrial toxins, any pesticides, or any other known carcinogens. And he was not. So then I saw in his medical history there was evidence that he was treated for hepatitis.
Well, hang on, Dr. Schustoff. Let's pause and let's skip over number 5 and 6, and we'll come back to 5 and 6 later. Let's move to number 7.
Sure. So then we always collect information about smoking, drinking, and drinking alcohol, and use of drugs. So, and smoking in general is always discussed in our oncologic field because it is a known risk factor for certain malignancies like lung cancer and bladder cancer and some others. And there's no compelling evidence that smoking is closely related to or was associated with lymphomas. However, it is such a broadly discussed risk factor for many medical problems that it always is included in our history.
Okay.
So while I identify that Mr. Hardeman had a history of smoking, first of all, his duration of non-smoking was substantial after he quit. And as I stated, that there is no strong link that was associated in the first place between lymphomas and smoking history. More so, as I pointed out in my report, there's very intriguing findings in other cancers like lung cancer indicated that when patients stop smoking, their risk of developing those cancers is decreasing by the case of not smoking. So, and in his case, his lymphoma was diagnosed 34 years after he quit smoking. But again, even if we consider this fact, there was no strong association with lymphomas. But I did include this in my professional diagnosis for discussion because that's what we typically do in oncologic assessment.
All right. Next, you had, it looks like Mr. Hardeman has moderate obesity. Why don't you talk about why you ruled that in and how you ruled it out?
So, obesity was interrogated in few studies that I recall, and I looked at one of them as possible causation for a few malignancies, a few cancers. And
Okay, and then next you have as a risk factor Roundup, which we've already discussed why you included that, but you have that his use of Roundup was both intensive, large quantities, and with no barrier to prevent absorption, inhalation, and prolonged over 24 years. Tell us what the significance of that statement was.
Well, I tell it as a medical oncologist and a lymphoma physician, and as just a physician, we hear about, before even looking at that the person is using something that is identified as a risk factor for a particular disease or particular cancer. When you ask any physician and say the patient was using any particular substance for 24 years or more on a regular basis, and it is a known risk factor for, in this case, lymphoma. So for a clinician, to me, it is a substantial exposure. But the reason I collected this information so that they can thoroughness and more of a rigorousness of this report, I tried to match that to what's reported in the literature to be a significant exposure to be a risk factor. And we already touched on that in a couple of publications that I reviewed from general causation literature. What they mentioned was 10 days per lifetime and 2 days per year exposure per the significant risk for developing lymphoma. So this was my benchmark to say whether plaintiffs used enough or this is not sufficient to really support general causation literature as a risk factor. In all three plaintiffs, but specifically Mr. Hardeman, the use of over 24 years with frequency that he described to me was far exceeding what I've seen in a couple of publications.
Okay, and before we get to the hepatitis C and hepatitis B risk factors, I want to note that I don't see that age is listed as a risk factor. However, you were asked about it in your deposition. Do you recall that testimony?
Yeah, I do recall that. And to tell the truth, the age is it's still a factor to interrogate, and you can interrogate any factor in, say, statistical analysis, but there has to be a good reason why you're asking this question. And to me, as a lymphoma specialist and doing research in therapy of lymphomas and being educated in this area, age is really still a factor to even consider because age is a reflection of something else. If you look at multitude of medical literature, what comes with age is heart disease, strokes, and diabetes, and whole slew of autoimmune diseases. So age is associated with pretty much most of the diseases that describe in humans. So give another example. One can look, say, at incidence of gray hair and cancer. Of course, you're going to find a correlation between gray hair and cancer because gray hair is more prevalent in older people, and older people get more of those diseases. It doesn't mean gray hair causes cancer. So to me, age is one of those factors. Yes, you can look at it. You can find a correlation. But for lymphoma scientists or a lymphoma expert, it is a nonsensical factor to interrogate. It just opens the door to look, okay, what comes with age? And you still have to look at factors, what patients who are older were exposed in the lifetime, why they develop lymphoma if they're older. But as I mentioned, on the general scale, age is a risk factor for anything. And if you say on a whole different level, is age associated with death? Of course age is associated with death. More people die when they're older and more people younger, but you will find statistical correlation. So to me, I'm just trying to demonstrate where I come from. Age is the one factor of interrogation.
All right, you could just repeat your last sentence, please.
What I said was age is the wrong factor to interrogate statistically against any disease because majority of human diseases are more prevalent with age. Now, it gives you the idea that there is something that people are exposed to longer when they're older, but it doesn't give you the reason why they develop lymphoma. So that's why I did not even include, I believe, in my discussion.
Okay, and just for efficiency's sake, you didn't include age in your risk factors of Mr. Gabayu or Ms. Stevick either, correct?
I did not.
And it's for the same rationale, right?
three cases, very, very similar, almost nearly identical in the sense that the diagnosis is the same, and I'm finding in the same on the same topic.
Okay, so now let's talk about hepatitis C as a risk factor for Mr. Hardiman, okay? And so we're going to move to number 5 of your differential diagnosis. And why don't you start by telling the court why you ruled in hepatitis C as a risk factor, and then why you were able to rule it out as a risk factor.
So I ruled hepatitis C into discussion of differential diagnosis because hepatitis has been linked or shown association with non-Hodgkin lymphoma in general. So that's where you have to really look at a particular patient and a particular clinical situation and see if the general causation really applies to this situation. So hepatitis C has unequivocal association with
Dr. Schustoff, you've read over 2,000 pages of Mr. Hardiman's medical records, correct?
That was a lot of paid, yes.
Yeah. And you test the presence of hepatitis C, or one tests the presence of hepatitis C by using a term called viral load, right?
And that is correct.
Okay, and from 2006 to today, has there ever been any presence of hepatitis C in Mr. Hardiman's viral load?
No, none of his records. And what's also very important to know that when we treat patients with lymphoma and apply multi-agent, very aggressive chemotherapy that he received against the immune system tumor, the patient immune system is basically annihilated for many months. So in general, when people have any hiding viral infections or chronic infections like viruses or TB, you would see activation or resurgence of those viruses in the low immune state. So even after Mr. Hardiman received 6 cycles of very aggressive multi-drug regimen, we still not seeing viruses. It's another kind of clue that it had nothing to do with causing lymphoma in the immediate past before the diagnosis, and for 8 years before, we did not see any evidence of it being present.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
Dr. Schustoff, I'm trying to think back to approximately 6 months ago for me when we were studying the issue of general causation. And my memory about that is a little bit vague, so I apologize if this question doesn't totally make sense. But my question is about the issue of latency periods, because when we were studying general causation, it became there were a lot of things that were debated, but one thing that seemed to be fairly clearly established with respect to NHL is that there could be a long latency period, 10-year, 20-year latency period from the time of exposure to glyphosate or whatever else might have caused the NHL to the initial development of symptoms or to diagnosis. And I guess if I'm remembering that concept correctly, I'm having trouble squaring it with what you're saying about the lack of a link between hepatitis C and NHL. Because if I don't recall when Mr. Hardiman was first diagnosed with hepatitis C, but you said that he didn't have any traces of it for 8 years in testing, right? But if we can often expect a 10-year latency period for NHL, then why would it not be consistent with his medical records to say that hepatitis C might have caused his NHL?
Your Honor, it's a great question, and it really.
Well, you're paid a lot of money to say that, but you don't have to say that. If it's a bad question, you really should tell me that it's a bad question. It's very important for the truth-seeking function to be honest with me if it's not a great question.
Your Honor, I've been very honest with you, and it actually requires explanation. So the way that viruses cause transformation of normal cells, whether it's lymphoma or liver cell in case of hepatitis B, they have to be operational. So the viral DNA does not cause damage to the cell DNA like simple chemicals like glyphosate does. So for viruses to transform the cell into cancer, they have to operate. They have to incorporate it to the cell DNA, and they have to function
Thank you. Is now a good? We've been going for about an hour and a half. Dr. Shustov hasn't been going for an hour and a half, but we have. Should we take? How much longer do you think you have, Ms. Wagstaff?
So I have us going right now for about 55 minutes, and I think we have about 20 minutes more is my hope, so that I can save about 20 minutes for redirect. So I can do it now, or I can do it later. Either.
Why don't we take a break now? Why don't we resume at 1:15, and then we'll hopefully finish up.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.